So the next one that we'll be discussing is contrast. Contrast is a strong difference between elements in an artwork. It involves using a bold or very different type of the same element in the artwork. Okay? Again, contrast is just using two very different versions of something together. That's the principle. But we can have contrast of line, contrast of shape, contrast of color, contrast of value, contrast of texture, and so on. Contrast of space, and so on. Okay. So how can we show contrast with lines? How can you make a design using contrasting lines? We need two very, very different lines working together, right? So you could do a design, maybe a pattern, where you're using really skinny lines. And then you introduce a really bold line. So it's like, whoa, these lines are really different. They're not kind of different, they're totally different. They're opposite versions of each other. Okay, and then maybe we want to go back to skinny line. And then we're going to go back to that really thick line. So we can see that this pattern has a strong sense of contrast between the really bold lines and the faint lines. Okay, we can even use contrast in our lines by making maybe some really jagged, interesting lines compared to really soft, straight lines. There's a lot of contrast between these two because they're so different. Okay, we can have contrast of shape if we make a design that's really like free flowing, a bunch of really organic, almost like a cow print. Okay, but if we introduce something like I don't know, like a geometric shape in here. Kind of like a star. Okay, we can see that there's a strong sense of contrast between the sharp edges of this and the really soft edges of all of these other shapes, right? It's that feeling of difference, right? You could draw a picture where something is much bigger in size in comparison to something else, okay? If you have a picture and you have a big tree, right? This giant tree, and then beside it you've got like this tiny little flower. Right? Looking at this picture, there's a sense of contrast because you've got something big and bold next to something very small. You can have contrast with color, right? You can have a really you can have a part of the picture be really bright. Okay, and the negative space could be white, meaning no other color. So you can have like, bam, color versus no color at all, right? Two extreme differences. Rather than having a bunch of different colors, you're going to have a pop of color, and then the rest is not going to have any color whatsoever. There's a strong feel of like disconnect, of intensity there, right? So again, contrast applies to any element. You can play around with contrast and apply it to any element. But again, it's that feeling of playing around with two extremely different versions of an element, using them together to create a bold, interesting feeling or look to the work. Okay, so whatever you come up with in here, just make sure that you have illustrated something, whether it's a design or a picture, where you've introduced two completely different things together. Maybe you did a picture in black and white, and there's no gray. Everything is either black or white, like extremely different.